Thank you. Okay, so yeah, again, I'm Rodger Voelker, and I'm the lab director at OG Analytical. I was asked tonight to talk about pesticides in concentrates specifically. But in order to get to concentrates, I think, really we need to talk more in general about pesticides. And also, it's really important for everybody to understand that, there's this current set of rules that we're operating under, but there is a new set of rules that is being written right now. And the new set of rules has the potential to have significant impact. And I think it's important, therefore, that we understand, we talk about this a little bit, to try to understand where we are now and where we're expected to be. So first of all, and the other thing I wanted to say here is that I didn't plan on coming up here and just talking for 20 minutes or whatever. What I really want is to raise some important points, and then I really want us to be able to focus and spend some time with questions and clarifying, I want to clarify topics as much as possible. Okay, so first of all, just to step back and let's look at the topic of pesticides per se. Okay, so at this, first of all, before you're doing that, I want to say, one thing, just set some perspective. We're here now because basically a lot of people fought for legalization of cannabis and won, right? Okay, what comes with that is responsibility. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm preaching, but I think it's really important that we accept that. So welcome to the world of commodities. With commodities comes consumers, and with consumers come lawyers. Okay? So that's the reality of it. It really is that. It really is about protecting people. It really is about guaranteeing people are safe. And it really is about protecting yourself from the potential of lawsuit, if you're a business or a distributor. And it really is about following the laws. Okay, that's the way it works. So with that as the precedent, or sort of the predicate, let's specifically talk about pesticides. So what are the laws that surround the usage of pesticides on sold commodities? So in this country, the law that addresses the use of pesticides on commodities is called FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. So basically FIFRA gives the authority over registration, application of pesticides, and tolerances of residue pesticides on raw agricultural commodities to the EPA. And it specifically grants sole authority to the EPA. And this is an important point that's going to come up in a moment. So the EPA has sole authority over specifying all the rules and regulations regarding the use of pesticides and which pesticides can be used and to what level they can remain when you sell the product. The FDA and departments of agriculture, they play a role with regards to what is considered acceptable levels of pesticides on finished products. Okay, so that's different. If you're selling the raw corn, that's EPA. Once you've turned it into cereal, that's the FDA. So anyway, that's what we're looking at. That's sort of the federal landscape. And it's important to understand this. The federal government that sets this. States are specifically, actually the language in FIFRA specifically states that states do not have the authority to establish tolerances or regulations regarding the use of pesticides without permission from the EPA. So there are processes for states to essentially create local special needs permits, essentially, but it's done through the EPA. Okay, so where is all this with regards to cannabis? So right now, yeah. So right now, cannabis, because it's a Schedule I drug by the EPA, it is not considered a crop. So there is. It has never. No one has ever evaluated it with regards to tolerances for pesticides. Okay. So that's the tolerance issue. The safety issue is one issue that has never been looked at. And as Jeff, talked about, no one has looked at that. On the other hand, you have to understand the way pesticide rules work. On the other hand, there is this thing called the label is the law. What that means is, if I'm a company and I have a pesticide product that I want to be able to sell to some farmer to use to control some pest on their grain, I have to go through this process with the EPA and get it registered for use on that crop. Application of any pesticide on a crop that is not listed on the label is a federal violation. It's a violation of FIFRA. No pesticide have been registered for use on cannabis, and therefore the application of any pesticide, and I'll clarify what I mean by any in a moment. But let's just say, so the application, let's say, of most pesticides on cannabis is a violation of federal law. I didn't write this. This is the way it is. Okay? Yeah. So, and this is important that we understand what is going on. So, at this point, the state of Oregon, all the states that are allowing, it's funny, whenever it was medical marijuana, people weren't paying much attention to pesticides, which I found a little strange, because you think of anything, that would be what is most relevant. But in the states that have legalized cannabis, they all are waking up to this problem that there's a lot of pesticide residues on cannabis. And there's a lot of pesticide usage. And everybody in the states already knew that that was technically illegal. But now they're in a position where they have to do something, right? They have to write laws regarding the pesticide use on cannabis. Every state that has looked into this has come to the same conclusion, and several of them have worked with the EPA in terms of evaluating this, and every state has come to the same conclusion. Whoops. There we go. Anyway, they've come to the same conclusion. I'm keeping you waiting. What is that conclusion? So the same conclusion that although they're willing to essentially violate a DEA law, which is because it's actually under this agreement with the DEA, the Cole Memorandum, or exactly what it's called, the EPA has issued no such agreement, and so therefore every state that evaluates this comes to the same conclusion. We cannot allow for the violation of FIFRA, okay? It's a federal law. We can't put in our rules, we can't make allowances for the application of pesticides on cannabis because that's a violation of a federal law. But that doesn't mean that states aren't now proceeding through this process of with a special local needs, whatever, but that's going to take a while. Okay, so that's sort of this whole legal background behind what's going on. So where are we left with that? The state of Oregon has just recently issued a document that describes where they're left, and it's the same conclusion that every other state has, and that is that you're allowed to use compounds that are called Section 25B. So they're listed in FIFRA under this section called 25B. And those are also the compounds that I think a lot of people in Oregon or in Eugene are probably familiar with, but these are compounds that are OMRI listed, right? So they're allowed on, and specifically with legally, what that means is there's actually specific language in FIFRA that exempts those compounds from federal tolerances. So that's why it isn't like this, like people are saying, oh, it's okay to use pesticides. We're going to allow pesticides to be used on corn, but we really want to punish those cannabis users, and so we're not going to allow them to use pesticides. This really is what's going on. It's just simply legal language at this point. But related to that is the simple fact, as Jeff talked about, you got to understand that when the government sets tolerances for pesticides, it is actually a very complicated and very expensive process that you have to go through to get a registration. And I expect that process will happen. This industry will mature, and people will push for this, and this will happen. But this is going to take time. I suspect a couple of years. I'm speculating, but we know this is a huge bureaucratic issue. The EPA has to come on board. It's going to take some time. So where we're at with that is it's important to now come back to where we are currently relative to where I started out. Talk about where we are right now and where I foresee this going. Right now, we're operating under a set of rules that everyone who is in the industry would admit are problematic. But it was a start, okay? That's fine. The current set of rules lists a few classes of pesticides that are considered, that if we detect them, that product can, it fails. In other words, it shouldn't be sold. However, we have to understand that that list that currently we're operating under actually represents only a tiny subset of all pesticides. So what that means is right now, I see myclobutanil or I see bifenazate. As far as the state of Oregon says, that's okay. That's going to change because the state of Oregon now has recognized that it has no choice but to change that, again, from a legal perspective, but also there's a lot of people who have a lot of concern from a health perspective because it isn't like we just find, generally we find let's establish some relative levels. Because I know that any of you guys have seen reports, you're going to see something like a ppm or a part per billion or something. What does that mean? Well, so most crops, the residues that are allowed are in the 1 part per million or high part per billion, like a couple hundred parts per billion. So whenever we see residues like that you can at least say that's consistent with other commodities. But we will on occasion see hundreds of parts per million, and that is disturbing because that suggests what's called misuse or inappropriate use of a pesticide. So that information together, basically the OHA is crafting a set of rules right now, but I can guarantee you that things are going to get a lot tighter. And so you know, we work with a lot of people already, and a lot of people in Eugene, I think, understand this, and a lot of people are adjusting their practices and to try to get to that point where they're going to be able to meet the new rules with no problem. But I think it's really important that everybody understand this is coming. So now, specifically back to concentrates. So people who are making extracts, okay, first of all, with flowers, I mean, I understand that there's problems that you're facing, which is why you turn to a pesticide. But the simple fact is that, you know, if you don't apply the pesticide, it's not going to be there. Now, people who are making concentrates, especially taking other people's products, are in a more difficult position because they never made a choice about the history of that trim. And what we've discovered is that when you make an extract, you concentrate cannabinoids, that's why you guys do it. However, many pesticides are concentrated by the same process. And so we will see often anywhere from a 5 to even 10-fold concentration of pesticides. So that's a problem. And on top of that, we have good anecdotal evidence. I wouldn't say it's completely convincing yet because we haven't done a very carefully controlled study. However, we're trying to work with people to do that. But we've got quite a bit of anecdotal information that there can be, once you've processed a very dirty sample, if you aren't really careful about cleaning your system, you have residual pesticides that are then going to contaminate following samples. Believe me, I have taken heat over, I've never used any pesticides, but what we would see is this, starting to work with people, is this what looked like the possibility of downstream contamination. Again, I think there's a lot of really good evidence that's happening, but we don't have completely conclusive proof that it's happening. But it's definitely a concern. So that's essentially a kind of inadvertent contamination that you can end up accruing. Now, specifically, you know, I think it's worth pointing out, I was asked to just talk really quickly about why is this happening? You know, why is it that when I make an extract, do I concentrate the pesticides? When we first started this, I don't know, I never really thought too much about it, but it seemed to me obvious that that would happen. But I understand it isn't necessarily obvious to everybody, especially because once we started doing this, I started looking around on the internet and finding people saying things like, you know, pesticides won't be extracted here in BHO and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is just, doesn't make any sense. Basically, so the one thing you got to keep in mind, it isn't all pesticides, but there's a large number of pesticides that have very similar molecular weights. They have very similar polarities, and therefore, essentially generally the same solubilities as cannabinoids. So any process that is designed to sort of enrich a cannabinoid, most cannabinoids, is likely to enrich most pesticides, not all pesticides. But it's that simple. They dissolve in the same solvents, and they actually have very similar properties. That's actually really all I got to say that I wanted to say, but I would love for questions. This is your opportunity to try to get some answers if you are confused about anything, or what, I've got the question here.
Hold on, I'm coming with the microphone.
Well, as we know, the EPA and the federal agencies are very irresponsible, such as in genetically modified, using more and more like Roundup ready crops, and now going to DDT and super weeds, etc. So I was rather shocked, because I go to the ELOC conference every year, that people are even using pesticides to grow cannabis. It comes down to people being aware of ecological concepts, starting with the soil, starting with, it's learning about becoming more of an organic practices. And there's lots of information on that. Having healthy soil leads to healthy plants. And so I'm wondering, I'm curious, where they're using the pesticides. Is this for indoor operations mostly? Or is it both? And what pesticides are they using?
Yeah, well, I don't obviously know the details usually. We worked with a number of people where I've learned a lot. And I really do, I encourage you to come by, and if you're interested in working with us, please do, because it helps me understand and learn about these problems so then we can try to help other people. But all I can say is that I think it's a mix, and obviously there's a lot of people here who know an awful lot more about cannabis than me in terms of growing it. I actually really know virtually nothing about that. So I don't know exactly the context and for which people are generally using pesticides. But, basically the pesticides that are likely to be, that we see are insecticides and fungicides primarily. People aren't going to be generally applying herbicides. We have looked for some of these plant growth regulators, and like paclobutrazol, and it's kind of interesting. We were seeing a lot more paclobutrazol at the beginning, but I think the word kind of got around, and people started to reevaluate that, and we haven't been seeing any paclobutrazol anymore. But it's definitely, is an issue from what I understand. Again, spider mites and various fungus. And so of which compounds we see, there's quite a few. The big ones, bifenthrin, bifenazate, myclobutanil. Those are the big ones that we see. We've seen quite a smattering of other compounds.
Yeah, just back in Mexico in the 70s, it was paraquat. And so,
yeah. So the quaternary ammoniums, like paraquat, diquat, we've never looked for that. It's a special test. I'm interested in that, but I don't foresee jumping into that anytime soon. OHA is actually, we've had discussions with them about it. So it's sort of on the radar, but I don't think it's there isn't a specific concern about it at this point. But
we had one over here.
I know someone who's using food-grade hydrogen peroxide in order to basically take fungus out of their roots.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that might affect someone later, like respiratorily, or exactly if it shows up in any of these tests, or...
So, no, we don't look for hydrogen peroxide. I think that would be very challenging. Or it'd be a very special test. Again, just to be clear, in terms of when I'm going to use the term pesticides from now on, actually all the time I use it,
yeah.
I'm specifically referring to those compounds that is listed in non-section 25B, which is 40 CFR 180 Part C. And so hydrogen peroxide is not one of those compounds, and so it is not something we're going to be looking for. Okay. Now, in terms of the toxicity of it and things, I'm not an expert on that. I couldn't say. I don't know if Jeff...
I'm going to give you the microphone.
It would probably break down very quickly, shouldn't go through any processing, and would be a rather good choice.
Thank you, Jeff.
So you aren't testing for the OMRI certified insecticides and whatnot, but they show up anyway, and are they concentrated just like the other?
Well, that's a good question. I actually suspect that most of those compounds would not, it's really hard to say. There's an awful lot of those compounds that, just because of their chemical nature, I don't foresee them concentrating. But there are compounds in there, like, there are actually terpenes and things. Some of those compounds might survive some of these extraction processes, but at the same time, like the terpenes are going to be losing those through many of these processes. I don't know. I have to look over the whole list. And then there's like a lot of detergents and things. Some of the detergents may survive. That's kind of an interesting one I haven't really thought about. But yeah, again, I mean, the bottom line is there's like 3,000 compounds that are we are real concern because they're under EPA regulation. And that's too much to do at this point anyway. So that's where the focus is.
What can you say about neonicotinoids?
Well, we do find them. Imidacloprid is is probably actually the fourth most common compound that we find. And at this point, we're only looking for, as far as the neonicotinoids, is imidacloprid, just because we haven't added the others yet. With the new rules, I suspect there's going to be about 5 neonicotinoids added. I mean, they're effective compounds, but they're definitely an ecological concern. I don't know what else to say about them other than that.
The first event that was held here was mentioned that was found by your lab, a totally organic grow room, and it was found the spot flea treatment. It turned out to belong to a cat. So as someone who has 3 cats that I flea treat, does anyone know, was it because the cats were in the room and rubbed against the plants? Was it on the hands of the owners and they didn't wash? Was it just the fact that it's in the environment, it absorbed into their skin, and was because there's nothing you can do about it, went into the plants?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Thank you. This is a huge topic. So basically, sort of this whole concept is encapsulated under this concept known as indirect contamination. If you are working in other commodities and things, you often will actually get a lot of training. There's something, I don't know if other people, I'm sure some of you guys work in operations where you've got this thing called HACCP, or there's good manufacturing practices. Much of HACCP and GMP is actually devoted to limiting indirect contamination. So a lot of the concepts that we're completely familiar with in other worlds just simply haven't been translated to this world. And so the example like you're referring to was, yes, a situation where we had an owner of a pet who was packaging some samples that they then provided to us. And when I found the compound, it was propoxyr, and I immediately suspected it actually came from a cat collar because that's about the only place most people are going to get a hold of that. And so I talked to him about that, and he admitted reluctantly because he felt ashamed because they were actually really they tried to do everything organic, but they just had a problem they couldn't deal with. So they bought a collar and put it on the cat. And he said they had just done that, and then he packaged the samples. So it came from his hands. We actually went, did investigation, and actually we were satisfied that really seemed, he sent me the collar and everything. But that was a good example of something that, again, you just have to think about. When if you're touching something that has pesticides, yes, it's on your hands, and it will get on your marijuana, or if you used an applicator to spray something on your garden, but then didn't clean it, it's best to have a completely separate applicator, right? So these are concepts, again, that are really familiar to people who are working in agriculture and stuff that we just have to really think about here. What's that?
So wearing gloves and washing my hands. So wearing gloves when I apply to my cat. And
Well,
then
I'm not
washing
saying
my
that.
hands
What
after. No, that's what I do.
washing your hands before going. You know, or I'll give you another example. We had an example of someone who brought their cannabis into their house to cure it, and they had a flea problem and set off a flea bomb. Okay, it doesn't take a lot to think about that, but
To be clear, they set off the flea bomb before they used their house
yeah,
for
yes,
drying.
it was before. That's true. I'm sorry, it wasn't. It wasn't when. That's right. The house had been contaminated, brought it in. But again, these are just things where, you know, we just have to have an awareness. That I think people are surprised that we find these compounds. But the bottom line is that we do, and there is usually an explanation. And I can actually usually tell if it was through a direct application or what we call indirect contamination. And if we have an indication of indirect, so I used to work at the Department of Ag, and I ran their pesticide testing lab, and that's what we studied, was we did investigations, we had to. And so it was, things broke down to determining whether it was through indirect contamination or direct contamination. Because in one case, that's a potential penalty. The other case is it's an investigation and potential penalty on somebody else, right? So I'm not saying I'm perfect at this, but if we find something and you're like, I didn't apply it, talk to me about it, because we can't figure it out until we do that. Anyway, sorry.